What's up, Jeffrey?
Hello, man. How are you?
All good, man. I ran a little bit late, so sorry for that. But
A lot of traffic jams.
yeah, it's shitty weather, so people don't forget how to drive when it's shitty weather,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
Yeah,
it's
that's cool. When you have your studio at home, you don't have a lot of traffic jams. It takes me like 20 seconds to get to my studio from the living room, which
yeah,
is
exactly,
cool.
exactly. Like to me
And
today,
when I bring
I
my daughter to school, that will take me 5 minutes by bike. So,
oh,
and
okay,
when it's raining, I usually take the car, but that's just me. So,
luxury.
yeah, yeah, luxury for
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
I like to work when I can. I'd like to work on different places.
Hmm.
So today I didn't have any meetings except for this one.
Yeah.
So I decided to go to an office of one of my friends, and then I just like to work in different environments every now and then to have different like yeah people
Yeah,
around
different
you,
context, different feeling. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
different
Yeah,
energy.
funnily enough, yesterday I went down to Jerboa Mastering in
Mm-hmm.
Belgium. As you might have known, I also have a company called Dutch Audio, and I
Mm-hmm.
make and design mastering consoles for mastering studios and also for recording studios. And Jerboa bought a console from me, and I did some modifications for him. So I went down to Belgium yesterday. So for me, it was also traffic jams and things like that. But
Yeah.
that was also cool. But for the rest, yeah, it's pretty much impossible to do my work somewhere else because I'm
Yeah.
used to my studio, I'm used to my monitoring. So usually I'm just working in my studio, unless I do lectures, of course,
Yeah.
because I'm doing a lot of lectures for School of Audio Engineering, SAE,
Mm-hmm.
and that's in Amsterdam. So I always have to go there to do those lectures, of course.
How often is that?
And yes, and also for Albeda College, which is in Rotterdam,
Mm-hmm.
which is the music department, which they have like the Albeda Music Producers course.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I also have to go down there, which is in the area of Rotterdam, which is like 15 minutes from here. So,
And
but usually, yeah, when I'm mastering, I'm working from home. So yeah, that's how it works for me, which is pretty cool. But yeah.
how often do you do those like schools?
It depends. With SAE, School of Audio Engineering,
Mm-hmm.
the courses, out of my mind, because I'm not officially working for them, start like 3 times a year, I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it means that over a period of a couple of weeks, I do that 3 times a year. And with Albeda College, it depends. It's the third and fourth grade students, and it depends there as well. And I also do
Okay.
lectures for sound education in my studio. So yeah, it's spread over a whole year. So it's not like this
Okay.
period. It's spread over the year, which
Okay.
is pretty cool. Sometimes it's pretty busy. December was actually really busy.
Mm-hmm.
I made like 80 hours a week or something like that during the last couple of weeks in December with mastering, Dutch audio, and teaching. And yeah, but yeah, to me, after all those years, it still doesn't feel like working
Yeah.
because you're doing something that you love, and then it's not working like going to your 9 to 5 job or something like that. It still doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, I can
So
imagine.
yeah,
And you're still
yeah,
smiling, so that's a good sign.
I'm still smiling. Yeah. Even though I have a bit of a cold, but for the rest,
Yeah.
I'm still smiling, definitely. Yeah, for
Well,
sure.
that's good to see. Well,
Yeah,
to everyone who's listening or watching this video right now, you might have seen this man before because this is the third time, I guess, the third time you're on
yeah,
the show.
something like that. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We did
And
a Skype session before. We
yeah.
did one live stream, I think, also on
Mhm.
Instagram, and I think something else as well. Not sure. Yeah,
Exactly. I think it's
yeah,
about the third time. But
yeah.
Jeffrey is a mastering engineer. I think that's the best way to describe what you do.
True. Yeah, I
Exactly.
am.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And that's why he's in his studio right now, as you can see in the background.
yep.
Let's start off talking about the environment because this is something that I see. Well, the question that I get a lot from well clients or just followers. Um, a lot of the producers out there are struggling to get a proper sound, so get a
Yeah,
proper mix and master at the same time.
yeah,
And they start asking me all these questions like which speakers do I have to buy, or which I don't know what kind of things do I have to buy to make things better. And I
yeah.
always tell them it all starts with your room.
True.
As in
100%
you
true.
can
Yeah,
you can buy the most expensive speakers on the planet, but if your room sucks, it's all yeah, it's all
it's not
unnecessary.
going to work. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
So
for
can you
sure.
explain
Yeah.
a bit more in Well, baby language, like how that
Yeah, yeah,
works.
yeah, how it works. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I also get a lot of questions like, yeah, what brand of speakers do I have to buy? It's pretty much comparable to cars because I drive Volvo. It's the most safe car in the world. It's the biggest, the most heavy, the most energy consuming car. Maybe even no, not true, but
Well, you have a green
it's a bit
studio, so
like
you're
cars.
kind of
Like
balancing
some
things out.
people like BMW, some people like
Hmm.
Mercedes Benz, and some people like Audi or whatever. You get the idea. It's not
Hmm.
like this car or this brand of speakers is the best speakers you should get.
Hmm.
It's always a matter of taste when it comes to the speakers itself. Um, but what's even more important, you already mentioned it, that the room where you put those speakers in is even more important than the speakers itself. Because if you have really brilliant speakers, but you have a room with a lot of reflections and things and a lot of dips and peaks in the low frequencies, those really brilliant speakers will behave like shitty speakers.
Yeah.
But
And
if you
just
have these,
for a beginner, because you mentioned when your room has peaks. What do you mean when you
yeah,
say peaks?
all rooms have what they call a room mode, which is reflections. And depending on which frequency it is, depending on how long, how big, how high your room is, you will get resonance frequencies. And that could be a peak
Hmm.
or a dip, depending on where you sit, where the bass is going to build up. It's basically what is happening. You have like a waveform, and the waveform is bouncing back, for instance, from the back wall, and it's bouncing back in exactly the same wave. But what happens, it adds
Doubles
to each
up.
other, so
Yeah.
those waveforms will be added on top of each other, so it's going to be louder on that frequency. Or it could be, let's say that the official frequency starts here and the bounce back frequency gets on top of that, it will null,
Yeah.
the sound will be gone. So
So
depending on where you sit, which frequency it is, depending on how big your room is, you will
that
always have those.
explains that when you have, let's say you have a home studio and you walk to the back of your room, you feel more bass,
Yeah,
and then
true.
when you're in the middle of your room, you kind of lost the bass.
Yeah, true. And
Okay.
that's not a good thing because then you have those bass frequencies
Hmm.
building up or canceling depending on where you stand, where you sit, yeah, what you just described. And that's a big problem because, for instance, let's say you have a problematic frequency at 50 hertz,
Hmm.
where a lot of energy of your bass drum is. Let's say you have a dip there. What you will always do, you will try to compensate in your mix, or maybe even in your master if you try to do that yourself, by boosting that frequency too much. But if you have too much energy there, because instead of that you have a dip, you have a peak, you're like, oh wow, there's way too much energy there. So you tend to cut that frequency too much, which means all of a sudden you don't have a lot of power in your bass drum.
Yeah.
So all rooms have those problems. There's not a single room which doesn't have that problem. And then there are people like, yeah, but you can get software and it will compensate. You cannot beat the law of physics. You
Hmm.
cannot make your room sound different or sound good with that software. That's physically impossible.
Yeah, I
If you
think
have
what
if
that
you have
software
room
actually does
correction,
is EQing, right?
yeah, but if you EQ it, let's say you have a dip and you EQ it, you're boosting that frequency.
Hmm.
It could be that it's a bit more flat at your sweet spot. But what could happen is that when you put your head back here, instead of a peak, it's going to be a dip or the other way around. And then you're making that problem even worse.
Mm.
And then you're just boosting the frequency. You're also dealing, and it's going to be complex now, you're also dealing with the time domain, which means it's not just the level of the frequency, but also the timing of the frequency, the decay, the ringing of that frequency.
Hmm.
And you cannot compensate for that as well. Like I said, with software, you simply cannot do that. There's only one way to fix those issues is that by using a lot of bass traps. And
Yeah.
also what a lot of people tend to do is go online and buy those cheap ass foam panels.
Yeah.
You see them online everywhere. Like, yeah, they sell them as bass traps. But what's really funny about those bass traps is that they actually don't work as a bass trap. Bass frequencies are, let's say, between 20 hertz and, I don't know, 150 hertz,
Hmm.
200 hertz. That's where your bass frequencies are, and that's where the problems will always be. But there's one problem with those foam panels. They don't work below 200 hertz, and they sell them to you as being bass traps. So they sell you something for problems which you cannot solve with these bass traps because they simply
those
don't
foam
work in that
panels,
area.
they work for mid and high frequencies, right?
Yeah, true. They work for mid and high frequencies, but because they don't work in low frequencies and because you're dampening those mid and high frequencies too much, it could be that you make the problem even worse than it actually was before.
Yeah, exactly.
So I always, when people are like, yeah, what foam panels should I buy? Don't buy those foam panels. They're just a waste of money. Get some proper acoustical treatment. Get big, heavy rock wool panels or things like that. Those panels will work in the frequency range that you want them to work. And so below 200 hertz or something like that. That's where the frequency problems are, not above that.
In my old studio, I've built like the wall in the back. I made it from some kind of like cotton. I think it was like a curtain that was hanging in front of it, and behind the curtain there was like a half a meter of rock wool.
Yeah, true.
And in front of that I put the couch. So I've heard that a couch also absorbs bass sounds.
Could be depending on how it works, but at least it could do something. Yeah.
So to me,
it's a start.
I really felt like that worked. But when I get the question from someone who has their studio at home, it's kind of impossible, right? Without redecorating the whole building and all those kind of things.
Yeah. It's like I said, with the software, you cannot beat the law of physics, and all rooms, no matter how long, how big, whatever, they will always have a resonance frequency, simply said. And depending on how long it is, it could be that it's at 50 hertz, at 40 hertz, 60 hertz, 70 hertz, whatever. It could be anything, but that's how sound works. And it only works if you use proper panels. There's no workaround for it. So what you could do is place your speakers maybe even closer to the wall or just a tiny bit away from the wall, things like that. You can do some experiments with it, but still you will always have really big peaks or dips or a combination of those. So and also a 100% flat room, that's also not possible. There will always be some peaks and dips, but they should not be like really big. And
exactly.
Because the bigger they are, the bigger the problem is.
Yeah, because let's take your room, for instance. This is a professional built studio. You still have like peaks as well, but
still not 100% flat. No.
Exactly, but I think that the difference between if you do mastering, you simply cannot master a track in a wrong room.
No, true, because let's say I have a dip at 50 hertz and I'm listening to a track. You don't want to guess like what I hear right now. Is it my room? Is it my speaker? Or is it the mix? You don't want to guess like, okay, this is the problem or not. I don't know. But let's boost that frequency or something like that. No, then you have a problem. As a full-time mastering engineer, you need to be 100% sure that what you're hearing is actually going on there. So no guessing. You don't want to guess.
Yeah, exactly. And does that also has to do with knowing your room, as in knowing where your dips are, knowing where your peaks are?
Yeah, true. But on the other hand, the human hearing is also really subjective. If, for instance, you listen to an album and that album doesn't have a lot of high frequencies, for instance. At the beginning, when you listen to that album, you're like, it sounds dark. There's not a lot of high frequencies. It sounds dark. But after, let's say, 2 or 3 tracks, you pretty much get used to it. Your ears, your brain adopts to it, and it still sounds good. But when that album is done and you listen to an album afterwards or a song afterwards, which is balanced, which is okay, all of a sudden it will feel like there's way too much highs in there because your brain, your hearing adopted to less high frequencies. Could also be in low frequencies, of course, but in this case I'm taking the high frequencies. But that's how the human brain works. The human brain is, human hearing, human brain is really, not objective when it comes to that. So.
And do you have like, because you once gave me a tip, which I think was pretty useful, that I think it had to do with mixing, not necessarily with mastering, but more with mixing. Well, I think with mastering as well. If you are going to mix or master your track, keep the master volume on one level.
Yeah, true. Yeah. maybe you heard of the Fletcher-Munson curve that was invented by Mr. Fletcher and Mr. Munson somewhere, I think, in the beginning of the 1900s.
Never heard of it.
And they found out that depending on how loud a sound is, you will hear more or less low frequencies, high frequencies. Depending on how loud it is, you're more perceiving those frequencies as being louder or less loud.
Okay.
The most flat response is roughly around 80 dB SPLA. So my room is calibrated to roughly 80 dB SPLA, which means I have a fixed monitor level. I always master at that monitor level. I have a separate screen with meters where I can see the actual levels and things like that. But I don't even have to use those meters because I know by ear if it's loud enough or not. And also, if, for instance, if you monitor at a lower level, you will hear those low frequencies as less loud, which means you will compensate for that and you will turn, in a mix or master, whatever you're doing, you will turn those low frequencies up more.
Okay.
But you're actually compensating for how the human brain works.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. And is there like any other thing that music producers sitting at home in their home studio could do or could implement into their whole system? Maybe it's like a software thing, or maybe it's just a simple tip, but is there something they can do to make mixing more easy?
First of all, like I said, like a calibrated monitoring setting. It doesn't like to be like really calibrated, like, okay, metering and whatever. But actually a fixed monitoring level will really work a lot, because if you do that, like what I said, your mixes will be a lot better. What you could do if you have like a pot meter, like a regular volume knob, just listen to what you think is the right sound. You can also download an app on your phone and use an SPL meter. If you look in the App Store for an SPL meter, you can see how loud it is. You have to set it to SPLA and see how loud it is. And it's a good idea to use something like between 80 and 83 dB SPLA.
For mixing.
And yeah, for mixes. So you made a mix, you're like, okay, this sounds great. Then you have your volume knob to, let's say, set to, I don't know, like 2 o'clock or something like that. And what you could do is use a marker, set a line there, and then that's your reference point.
Okay.
Sometimes you want to turn the volume up to see what it sounds like when you turn it up. And if it's louder, sometimes you want to turn it down to see what it sounds like when it's less loud. But after that, you get back to your reference point where you set a line with a marker. But what happens if you turn it up and you don't have that line, and you turn it down? Your ears are already used to the louder sound. So instead of the reference point being at 2 o'clock, you probably turn it to 3 o'clock or something like that. So you most likely turn it up louder than before.
Yeah.
And after 10 minutes, you do the same thing again. You turn it up and you turn it down again, but even then a tiny bit more loud than before that setting.
Yeah. And
that is pretty problematic because, first of all, it's really tiring to listen to really loud sounds when mixing. So you will get hearing fatigue. You simply get tired, but also more chance of hearing damage.
Yeah.
Because I don't know the exact values, but at 80 dB, in a working environment, you're allowed to work, I think, like 7 or 8 hours at 80 dB SPL. But when you go to 85 dB SPL, all of a sudden you're not allowed to work longer than like 5 hours or something like that instead of 8 hours. And the louder you go, the less time you are allowed to work in that in that loudness.
Yeah.
So it's also bad for your hearing to work at those levels.
Yeah. So keep your knob at a fixed volume.
Monitoring
is one
level.
Of them.
Yeah.
Is there anything else they could do? So maybe work with curtains, or maybe put a couch in the back, or I don't know.
Yeah, do things like that. But also making bass traps or buying bass traps, real bass traps, is not really that expensive. For instance, if you go to GIK Acoustics, they're not that expensive and they have really good products. And you can also send them an email like, okay, this is my room. What product should I buy? And they also give you some tips like, you should put it there, you should put it there, or something like that. They're really good at these kind of things. But you can also make them yourself if you want. The material is not that expensive. It just takes quite some time to make them look good as well, because you don't want to put some kind of block of rock wool in the back of your room or in the front of your room or something like that. Yeah. Always, by the way, bass buildup, like those resonances, is most likely coming from the back wall, but also is building up in corners. So it's always a good idea to start with those bass traps by putting them in the corners of your room, because that's where the bass buildup is mostly active, simply said. Yeah.
That's good
so,
to know. That's good to know. Okay, so I was thinking there was one other thing I wanted to ask, because I was talking about this with one of my clients yesterday, and I told him that I was going to speak to you today, so I was going to ask it for him. He asked, is it a bad thing to put a limiter on a kick?
No, it's music. There are no laws. So
that
the
was
only
exactly
thing is
that was my answer. I told him the same exact thing.
The cool thing, what they always say, what I always also say is that you should know the rules to know how to break the rules. There are no rules in music, but depending on how you work. For instance, if you want to send your mixes to a mastering engineer, and some people are like, yeah, I'm mixing with a limiter on my master bus, so the complete mix is going through a limiter. That's not a good idea, because then you're literally limited as a mastering engineer to what you can do to the sound, because all the dynamics are gone. It's already flat, and it's lifeless. And when you overdid it, your hands are tied as a mastering engineer. So I also don't think it's a good idea to mix with a limiter on the master bus. But on the other hand, it's also good to know what happens if the track gets mastered. So it's also a good idea so let's say you have done your mix, then you add a limiter to see what it sounds like after limiting. So basically what it could sound like after mastering, so that you know that your track has the loudness potential, or kind of that it doesn't fall apart. But actually mixing with a limiter on all the time, I don't think it's a good idea.
But putting a limiter on a kick doesn't necessarily have to.
No,
has to
that
be
doesn't
bad.
matter. No.
Okay.
No. To be honest, I don't think it will add something to the sound. Maybe some compression will add something to the sound, because a limiter is just limiting those peaks. And the bass drum should be peaking. The bass drum should not be flat. No, the bass drum should have a peak. It should have punch, and a punch is a peak. So, my guts say it's not a good idea to do, but it doesn't add anything to the sound. You will just make the kick drum flat. Okay. But if it sounds good, it is good.
Yeah, that's the golden rule, you know. If it sounds good, it's good.
So,
That's the way how I like it, at least.
Yeah.
Nobody cares about how it's made, right? Cool.
So
well, that was just one thing that popped up that I needed to ask. You told me that you kind of prepared some points, like things that were updated or whatever that you wanted to go over.
I have a couple of trends that seem to be going on right now. In some kind of way, there are quite some people, especially in the mostly in the dance scene, that are like, I want my tracks to be mastered with stems, because if I do stem mastering, the end result will be better. I have no idea where that came from. Because
for everyone listening, what's the difference between those two things?
Mastering is based on working with the stereo mix. So just the left and right channels, so the complete mix. And that's where the mastering engineer is working on. With stems, it will be grouped into, let's say, 4 or 5 groups or something like that. So the instruments, the bass drum, the bass line, and the vocals, for instance. But if your mix is good, stem mastering will not make the end result better. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions right now, that people think that it will always be better with stem mastering. That's bullshit. If your mix is crappy, trust me, with stem mastering, it will still be a crappy mix. It will not be fixed with stem mastering. And also, let's say it could be fixed with stems. The next time you go to the same mastering engineer, could be me, could be anything, could be anybody else, you will still make the same mistake again, because the mix was crappy, because you probably made a mistake. I believe more in the fact that as a mastering engineer, that you should always give feedback on the mix, like, okay, mix is good, but I think the bass drum should be, 2 dB louder, the bass line should be there, and I think it's better to do it like this, because then the end result will be better, because the mix is better. And the next time, you still have to the bass drum should have been louder. Okay, bam, all of a sudden you're doing that. So you're learning, and you can focus, because you already learned that, you can focus on different things as well. So for instance, making your hi-hat sound even better, or making better melodies or whatever. So with those stem mastering, the only reason why stem mastering is really cool is for the mastering engineer itself, because he can charge more.
More control. Yeah, and the thing, that's what I wanted to ask,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
if you do
Because
stem
it's more
mastering,
expensive.
exactly, it's going to take more hours, because
Yeah,
now
it
you're
takes
going to do
longer. Yeah,
the
yeah,
mixing and the mastering.
yeah, yeah. And also, some people are also still confusing stem mastering with mixing. Sometimes people are coming to me like, yeah, could you master this track for me? And all of a sudden I get a WeTransfer of like 5 gigabytes for one track. I'm like, okay. And then I open up the file and I see like 50 stems.
Yeah,
That's not mastering, that's mixing.
mixing.
It's two
Yeah.
different things. And I'm not a mixing engineer. So yeah.
The difference is, mixing is literally all the elements that a track has, right?
Yep. Yep.
Stem mastering is groups.
Yep.
And mastering is the whole
whole
thing in
mix.
once.
Yeah,
Yeah.
true.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and also what a lot of people don't even realize, quite a lot of people mix with something like an equalizer or a bus compressor on their master bus. And if they export stems and put those stems on top of each other, it will sound different.
Yeah.
Because if you bounce the complete mix, all those elements go through the same chain, go through the same master section, bus processing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do it with separate stems, they will respond differently.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So
Yeah.
it could be that the end result will be even less.
Yeah. Good one.
That
Good
with
point.
the stereo mix.
So what was the other point that you wanted to go?
Yeah, I also see a trend with vinyl. Vinyl used to be pretty big for DJs. You can see it, but I have quite a lot of
vinyl. Sorry, I thought you meant vinyl.
Maybe you can see one of the turntables in the back.
Yeah, vinyl. Okay.
Yeah. But back in the days, all DJs were playing with vinyl, and I noticed that with techno and also not really with EDM, but with techno and some clubby tracks, that people are going for vinyl again, which is pretty cool. But what they forget to ask the mastering engineer is that they are going to release it on vinyl, and because you need a separate master for vinyl, because. Yeah. If you have a digital release, you will use limiting, maybe some clipping, whatever you want it to be loud. Not that loud, but you get the idea. You want it loud. But limiting and especially clipping works the opposite on vinyl. You need dynamics, you need transients. Otherwise, sometimes it cannot be even cut on vinyl. And so they are like, yeah, could you send me a master? Yeah, cool, I make a master. But they don't ask for a vinyl master next to it. So if you're going to release on vinyl as well, always keep in mind that you need separate masters for vinyl. And that's just the limiting part. But for instance, if you have really edgy high frequencies or loud cymbal crashes or things like that, those can also not be cut on vinyl. So a mastering engineer also needs to take these kind of things into account. But also low frequencies in stereo, especially out of phase low frequencies, could not be cut on vinyl. And in the EDM scene nowadays, what a lot of producers do is make, for some kind of reason they think they can go louder, is make the bass line really wide, really stereo, and keep the bass drum in the middle. So they think that it's separated and it can go louder. Bullshit, but a completely different story. But those bass lines could sometimes not be cut on vinyl.
Because they're stereo.
Because they are too stereo. So that could be problematic as well. Okay. So it's always a good idea that when you're going to release on vinyl, or if you have plans on releasing on vinyl, at least mention it to the mastering engineer so he can make separate masters for vinyl, because you simply need those. So
I think the reason why people make those bass lines wider might be that it sounds a bit warmer.
Could be. But they also forget that in a club, a lot of PA systems are set to mono. Yep. And especially the bass. So it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Especially when your music gets played on the radio as well, that might be a problem.
They do a lot of processing, but I don't think that they make the bass more mono. Maybe they do, but I don't think they do that. They do a lot of things like compression and things like that, but not making it more mono. By the way, and you're making your bass more mono, a subwoofer system, what you have in the living room, only has one subwoofer in the middle. So there you go with your really wide bass sounds played in the center.
Yeah.
So yeah. As long as when it comes to bass lines, which you can hear, let's say at 200 hertz, above 150 hertz or something like that, then you can hear where the actual bass sound is coming from. But
So then it's
below that,
okay.
it's pretty hard to actually hear where the sound itself is coming from. That's the system, the how the whole subwoofer system works. You put a subwoofer somewhere in the back of your room, and you don't hear that it's coming from the back of your room. You just hear the bass all
Just
around you.
yeah. Okay.
So,
So
so also for
if
these
you still
things,
would like to
yeah.
get the stereo feeling of the bass, what's a better way to create that?
You can do that by adding harmonics, and those harmonics are not really the really low bass frequencies, but like, let's say you have a bass line which is at, I don't know, 80 hertz.
Hmm.
Then you get an upper harmonic which is at 160 hertz, 320 hertz.
Hmm.
So all of a sudden you hear those harmonics, and those harmonics could be stereo,
Hmm.
but not the official bass frequency. The harmonics could be more stereo. So you get a feeling of a really wide bass, but the actual low bass is not really stereo.
Hmm. And how can that be done?
Um, if you add distortion, simply said, you're
Okay.
adding harmonics.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
if you add distortion, you're adding harmonics. That's what I also do. Not sure if you can see it. The yellow compressor you can see
Hmm.
right there
Yeah.
is adding quite a lot of harmonics. That's a tube compressor with transformers and things like that. Sometimes I'm just passing through the audio to create harmonics, to add those harmonics,
Okay.
because everybody is also listening to music nowadays on phone speakers.
Hmm.
Those phone speakers don't go down to, let's say, 80 hertz, 100 hertz or something. No. So you don't hear those bass frequencies. But because you're adding those harmonics, all of a sudden you still hear those low frequencies. At least you think that you hear those
Yeah.
frequencies. That's how the human brain works. You're making that up.
So it's also
You're
tricking the mind at the same time.
you're basically tricking the mind to
Okay.
listen to those low frequencies. So adding
Interesting.
those harmonics. Yeah.
Interesting. It's a
Yeah.
weird thing, right? The human ear and how it communicates with your brain, and
Yeah.
yeah, it's a weird
Yeah.
thing. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. A lot of times when you buy those small Bluetooth speakers, for instance, you're like, oh wow, it still has a lot of bass. But you're not listening to those low bass frequencies. They also make use of those harmonics.
Same with
So
Sonos
you,
as well. Did they do the same?
uh,
I'm not
I don't
sure.
know. I think so. I'm not a big fan of Sonos to be honest.
Yeah,
But
I have the play bar and the ones. I think the ones may do it, but the play
mhm.
bar has a lot of speakers in it, so I'm not sure if
Okay,
the
yeah, it
play
could be
bar.
that they play back those low frequencies, but those smaller ones, the
Yeah,
JBLs and things like that, I know that they make use of those harmonics.
yeah, I can
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah,
Yeah, because
yeah,
it's so small, like it's almost impossible to
yeah,
replicate it.
yeah. You
Well,
need room for those
exactly.
frequencies. Yeah, and yeah.
Because that's also one thing that people ask when it comes down to speakers, like the size. In this matter, size does matter, right? The bigger the
Um,
cone, the bigger the bass can be.
yes and no.
Hmm.
It's true, but the bigger the speaker, the bigger you go with your speaker. It's also because of the actual volume of the speaker itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's also moving slower, which means uh, the how should I say it? The actual sound is less precise because the speaker is like
Oh,
vibrating
really?
and things. The bigger you go.
Oh. Oh
So it
shit.
can go lower for sure, and it can make, because the actual volume is bigger,
Hmm.
it can produce more of those low frequencies. But with higher frequencies, it gets more problematic.
So
So, and you
for a
also want
studio,
those mid low frequencies. Yeah.
so for a studio environment, it would be better to have like smaller conuses. Is that the right
Yeah.
word?
Usually, I think the regular near field monitors that you buy, like the Adams or whatever, have like a bass speaker of like, I think it's 6 inch or something like that, or
Could be.
six, some of them 8 inch. Yeah, that's it. For instance, to give you a good example, back in the days you had a Mackie HR624
Hmm.
and a Mackie HR824. The difference was that the Mackie HR624 had a 6 inch speaker and the 824 had an 8 inch speaker.
Hmm.
The 624 was better at mid frequencies, but the 824 was better at low frequencies. So that for the rest, it was pretty much the same speaker. It's just that the bass speaker had a different size, and because of that, it sounded different.
Exactly.
So
Makes
yeah,
sense.
it's a combination.
What
Yeah.
do you think about? Because I'm a big fan, and I believe we talked about this before, but I'm just curious. Uh, what's your opinion on those sub bass things?
The sub pack.
Sorry, yeah, the sub pack
Yeah, the
things,
sub pack.
the ones that you put in the chair or you can use as a
To be
vest.
yeah, to be honest, I still haven't used it.
Oh,
Maybe I
okay, yeah,
should come down to your office.
yeah,
I still haven't used it.
okay,
So yeah, I think it's cool because you can feel those low frequencies. But I
exactly.
think my gut say that it feels um, unnatural at lower levels.
You really
Not
have to
sure if
get
it's the
used to it.
case, but
Yeah.
because at low levels you usually don't feel the bass, and when you feel the bass at low levels, my gut say that it's unnatural. But I
Well,
could
you
be.
can. The
I
one
have
thing
no
is,
idea.
you
Yeah,
can literally feel your gut because things start to shake pretty heavily.
yeah,
But it's. I really think that it's a great addition, especially for people with a home studio,
yeah.
because you can still, well, you feel like you're inside a club, but your
Inside the club.
neighbors don't
Yeah,
really care about it. So I think that's a great solution, and I'm really amazed by the fact how precise it is, how much it helps if you feel the frequencies.
yeah,
It
yeah. I
really
can
helps you.
imagine. Yeah,
Yeah, but
yeah,
yeah. If you ever come over, or if I ever
yeah,
come to you, I'll bring it, and
yeah.
you can check
I
it
still
out.
have to listen to it. Like I said, I have no personal experience with
Okay.
it. So yeah,
I thought you I thought we had to talk about it
yeah,
before. I'm not
yeah. We
sure.
talked about it before. That's true. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I still haven't tried it. Sometimes I see people like, oh yeah, I still should check it out to see
Yeah.
what it feels like. Yeah, things like
I'm
that.
not
Yeah.
sure if it's something for you for as a mastering engineer. I
No,
think it's
I'm pretty sure. Yeah,
exactly.
I think for a music producer, especially when you're in a small room, small
Hmm.
speakers, things like that, then it could work. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think to be honest, I think it's better than adding subwoofers,
Hmm.
um, because a lot of times when you're adding subwoofers to your monitoring system, you're making the problem bigger than without subwoofers.
Yeah, because the room isn't properly treated
No,
yet,
and
and
phase alignment, and
yeah.
so those cancellations that we talked about in the beginning could be even worse.
Mm.
Cancellations or those peaks could be worse, and also what a lot of people do when they buy a subwoofer, they're like crank it up all the way because they're like, yeah, now I can finally hear the bass.
Yeah.
When you hear the subwoofer, you've done it wrong. You should not hear the subwoofer. You
Just
should
feel it.
just like feel it pretty much like, something's happening, but I don't really pay attention to it. When you're paying attention to it, you overdid it. It should be flat. When you make a really big boost at the sub frequencies, you're overdoing it. Might sound impressive, especially for your friends,
Yeah.
but it's not how the actual sound is, and that's where it gets problematic.
Okay.
So, yeah.
What else was on your list?
The cool thing is, what I really noticed right now is that the loudness war is actually people are trying to understand nowadays that you will not win the war by going that loud.
That's why you're smiling.
Yeah, yeah. I already say it for years,
Hmm.
but I actually notice it now. Back in the days, like, I don't know, like 2 years ago, when the loudness normalization was already there, but nobody knew about it, people were like, I made a master which was already pretty loud. And it happened quite often that they were like, yeah, could you maybe crank it up just a tiny bit more so that it's going to be a tiny bit more loud than this? Nowadays, I make less loud masters than those masters which should be louder. So the masters are already a tiny bit less loud. And still then people are in the opposite direction. Like, yeah, could you maybe do a version which is just a tiny bit more loud to see what it sounds like then? And it also happens that I send them two versions, one loud version and one less loud version. And back in the days, there was no discussion. The less loud version was skipped and they always picked the loud version.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I noticed that people are like, yeah, we compare them and the less loud version sounds better. So
Interesting.
people are finally realizing that going that loud doesn't make sense because of the loudness normalization. There are still a lot of misconceptions, and we can talk for hours about that.
Yeah.
But trust me, you don't want it to be too dynamic because, for instance, an EDM track, it's part of the sound to go loud.
Mhm.
That's part of the sound. You still want the crushed, you still want the compressed, you still want a
To have
limited
the
sound.
energy,
That's yeah, you want that energy. But there's a certain point where you make it louder, you will simply crush it to make it louder and not by giving it that sound. And you want to stay below that point. You just want to listen to how it sounds.
Mm-hmm.
And the numbers don't matter at all. Trust me, if I make a master at, let's say, -6 or -8, those numbers mean nothing, especially on Spotify. It could be, and actually it is, that -8 master sounds louder on Spotify, louder on YouTube than that -6 master.
Yeah, because they have
Because
those.
loudness normalization takes it down more.
Yeah, exactly.
What a lot of people don't realize is that the measurement for the loudness normalization, all streaming services use it. Spotify, YouTube, you name them, all use the loudness normalization. It's not like they are measuring the peaks or something. No, they measure the complete track from the beginning till the end. And then the overall level of the track is, let's say, -10, will be brought down to -14, for instance, for YouTube. But that overall level is built up from the loud passages and the soft passages. And if you make the differences between the loud and the soft passages bigger, the soft passages will take the overall level down, which means that the loud passages, like the drop, could be louder.
So that's why you want to have more dynamics.
You want more dynamics.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you make it too dynamic, that's also not working. I always say when it comes to the overall balance in frequencies, I'm talking about the yin and yang of those frequencies. But it's also the same for the dynamics of music. It's also the yin and yang of those dynamics. Sometimes you want this dynamic range, sometimes you want this dynamic range, sometimes you want this dynamic range.
Yeah.
It really depends on the music. It's not like an absolute, like it should be with this amount of dynamics or this amount of dynamics. No, whatever works best for the track.
Yeah.
So just listen to the track and make it work like that. My son is calling me. I don't know why. He's calling me.
No worries. So again, no rules.
No rules. No, just listen. It's about sound. It's about how it sounds, how it works, how it feels. Use your gut and don't pay attention to the numbers. The numbers don't mean a thing.
Exactly.
Especially also for Spotify and whatever. People are like, yeah, I'm going to master it to -14. That's bullshit. If you master it to -14, your track will be less loud. Trust me.
Okay. What else was on the list? Is there anything else?
Yeah, this the loudness normalization. Yeah, I also had one. I could even not even. Yeah, like the.
Not even read it.
The one thing with streaming. One of the misconceptions is that they are all working at -14, so you should master your track to -14. That's not true, because like I said, some track sounds better at -6, -8, or whatever. It really depends. But also, right now, Spotify is not using the loudness normalization that, for instance, YouTube is using. YouTube quite recently went from -13 to -14 by using the official LUFS values, loudness unit full scale. That's where they measure it in. But that is done with a K-weighting curve. So they use a curve. You're less sensitive, the Fletcher-Munson curve that we talked about in the beginning. You're less sensitive to low frequencies. So during the measurement, they take those low frequencies out. They don't make that much sense for the measurement, so they take them out. But you're more sensitive to high frequencies. So for the measurement, they boost the high frequencies. So that's how they measure the loudness, how you perceive the loudness. That's why they call it perceived loudness.
Okay.
But that works for YouTube, Deezer, Tidal, things like that. But Spotify is not using official LUFS standard measurements. They don't use a K-weighting curve. So it could be that even though Spotify and YouTube are both at -14, that your track is louder or less loud on Spotify compared to YouTube. And that is because they don't use a K-weighting curve.
And that's why you also offer as a mastering engineer, like having several masters, several types of masters.
No, I'm delivering two types of masters, which is a digital louder master, and I'm delivering a streaming master, which is dedicated for streaming services with a maximum peak value of -1 dB, and also taking into account how it will end up on streaming services with loudness and things like that.
Okay.
But I also take the overall frequency balance in mind when it comes to the low frequencies, because like I said, the low frequencies are less important with the official K-weighting system, but they are more important on Spotify. So a track with a lot of bass frequencies will be turned down more on Spotify because the measurement is different. So I also take these things into account. So the yin and yang of these frequencies is also important. By the way, Spotify announced that by the end of 2019, they were, before the end of 2019, they would be using the official K-weighting system.
Okay, so they changed again.
No, they make quite a lot of announcements, but they don't stick to their announcements.
Oh, they haven't changed it?
They haven't changed it.
Oh.
So it's still -14, which is good, but they still don't use the K-weighting curve.
Okay.
They are still using their own older system with replay gain, which is fine.
But doesn't that mean that if they change the whole system, you should also replace your master file?
No,
Okay.
because the measurement is taking place at Spotify, so you don't have to measure those things again. So that's one of the things that people do, and they're like, yeah, it needs to be this loud, and I need to make a master dedicated for this and this and this. You don't want that. You don't want a separate master for iTunes. You don't want a separate master for this. You want one master for streaming services. So
makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to deliver 20 types of masters.
No,
No,
nobody's
that's
waiting
not going
for
to
that.
work.
Imagine that, sending it to the label, like 20 types of master. Here you go.
Yeah. This one should be uploaded to YouTube. This is for this. This is for this.
That will be a disaster. Guaranteed.
But that's still happening. There's one thing, by the way, with Spotify as well, and that's actually, I think, a pretty big problem with the loudness normalization. There's 3 settings. Maybe you've seen it in the app that you can choose between normal, loud, and dynamic, I think it's called. The normal one is normalizing at -14. And when your track is less loud than -14, it's just playing back less loud as -14. The same goes for dynamic, which is at -23. If your track is less loud than -23, it's a really low level track, but it could be it's playing back lower than -23. And then you have the loud setting, which is normalizing at -11. That was the old standards for Spotify. But when your track is not -11, but let's say -13, so to be less loud, they will use a limiter to make it louder to -11. And
So
that's why it's problematic, because you don't want Spotify to limit your track. You don't want Spotify to mess with your music. You just want it to be the same sound, because you don't know how the limiter sounds.
And that's a setting that the listener needs to
making. Yeah,
exactly.
You have 3 settings in the loudness normalization setting. I have no idea how many people are listening to the loud setting, but I can imagine that some people are like, yeah, this sounds
the loudest,
so it's better.
Yeah.
So what I always try to do is, especially with pop, rock, dance, things like that, I make my masters at least -11 LUFS, which means it will not be turned up by Spotify.
Yeah.
And for pop, rock, dance, things like that, it's no problem at all to make it -11. So you don't have to worry about that. But that's a thing that I know that some mastering engineers were doing. They were aiming for -14 because it would be turned down anyway. So why make it louder? Doesn't make sense. But those tracks would be turned up. And all of a sudden, it sounded crushed because the Spotify limiter, it's not that good.
So don't put your setting on to the loudest.
No, whatever you want. I can imagine that for dance and you want it loud on your headphones. Yeah, maybe the loud setting sounds good. I never tried it, to be honest.
Me neither. I think I've seen it before, but I normally on my phone, because on your iPhone you can also change your EQing of how you listen to music. But I never touch those things. But it could be done. People might use it.
Yeah, that's also one of the problems that people are like, those EQs, what a lot of people do is make a smiley EQ, boost the low frequencies and boost the high frequencies.
That's hi-fi,
because it sounds, hi-fi. Yeah. The loudness, literally, if you have a loudness knob on your amplifier back in the days, it was basically doing that, boosting the lows and the highs. What it was doing is compensate for the Fletcher-Munson curve again. So Mr. Fletcher and Munson did something right in the beginning of the 1900s by inventing that. But what if you master your track with a lot of bass and a lot of highs, so basically too much bass and too much highs, and you're playing it back from your iPhone with boosting lows and highs as well,
Double.
double.
Yeah.
And the mid-range is actually the most important part of your music, because if you have a track with vocals, synthesizers, whatever, they're all taking place in the mid-range.
It's all disappearing.
But yeah, that's where it happens. From
Yeah.
400 hertz to, let's say, 4 kilohertz. That's where the actual power of your music is. That's not in the low frequencies. That's not in the high frequencies. It's in the mid frequencies. And what you're doing when you're boosting lows, boosting the highs, and playing it back like that, you're doing pretty much a really big dip in the mid frequencies, and that's not what you want. So, yeah.
Interesting. It's all really technical, but it's like I can follow all the things because I know. Well, I've been into this stuff we've talked a couple of times, and I've been doing this stuff for a long time. But still, it's so interesting to see how all those things work and how software companies play with it, as in make plugins or make like this room composition things that's supposed to work. Just really interesting to keep track on those things. While in the end, it's all so basic. It's just sound, which you said, like that's. You don't fuck with the rules, as in it's just the way it works.
Yeah, true.
It's just physics.
Yeah, and let's face it, those plugin manufacturers will simply try to sell you those plugins.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
That's their business.
Yeah. Talking about plugins, is there one that has been released lately which you could recommend?
During Amsterdam Dance event, I was invited by Isotope, so from Ozone and things, to talk about Ozone 9. So it was released, I think something like during Amsterdam Dance event, so I got a license a couple of weeks before that. And so Ozone 9 itself is pretty amazing, and especially there's a function called Master Rebalance. And in the beginning, I was like, no, this is not possible. What you could do, you have 3 options. You can choose between vocal, drums, and bass. And especially the vocals, what you could do when you set it to vocals, you have a volume slider, simply said. You can go up, I think, 60 dB and down 60 dB or 10 dB, whatever it is. And you can simply turn the level of the vocals up and down.
Wow. So it just filters
pretty
out
much
that part.
like as if you're mixing and you're just turning the vocals up and down. Sure, when you do it into the extremes, like boosting 60 dB or something like that, then you will hear some artifacts. But when you're doing something like 1 dB of boosting or 1 dB of cutting, which means you're just bringing the vocals up just a tiny bit more or bringing it just a tiny bit more down, it really works. Like, I was really amazed by how good it sounds, how good you can make it sound.
Yeah,
and because what happened a lot is that I asked for a revision of a mix, like, could you turn the vocals up a tiny bit more, or maybe turn the vocals down a tiny bit more? I don't have to ask for a remix when it comes to vocals. I can just do it myself.
That's great.
And so far,
I
didn't have any track where it didn't work. I just finished a master for Kraak en Smaak, a radio edit, and for radio, it's a good idea to turn the vocals up a tiny bit more. So the mix was pretty good, but it was like, yeah, for radio, it might be a good idea to make the vocals just a tiny bit more loud. So I turned the vocals up like 1 dB, 1.2 dB or something like that. And it sounded more radio right away.
Wow.
And I didn't have to ask for a remix. Yeah, it's really amazing how it works.
I'll check it out, because I'm a big fan of Isotope and of Ozone as well, because the one, I think they launched it last year as well, maybe 2 years ago, the vocalizer. No, vocal synth. I think it's vocal synth.
Okay, yeah, maybe. I do have a license for sure, because I got a license from them.
It's a plugin which actually, if you put in a vocal, it kind of adds layers to it, harmonics, all those kind of things. It just, if you work with vocals, I really think it's a great piece of software. But I'll definitely check out the Isotope as well, because I think I'm still using 7. Yeah,
I think it's Ozone 9 right now.
Okay,
yeah, still Ozone 7 is also pretty good, but you get those extra functions like the master rebalance and some other things as well. But the master rebalance, I was really amazed by how good it sounded, and I prepared some tracks, of course, and during Amsterdam Dance event, and I was making the people listen to the difference, and it was more like I was mixing the track like. Turning the vocals up and down, but it was like actually just using the master rebalance thing. Yeah,
it's kind of like stem mastering.
Sorry,
it's kind of like stem mastering.
Pretty much,
Yeah.
yeah. You can add a tiny bit more level to the vocals or turn it down
Yeah.
more. You can also do the same thing with the drums, which is you can hear more that something is going on there, but you can also make the drums a bit more punchy because of that and things like that. One moment. Jongens, ik zit even aan de telefoon. Okay, I'm back.
Good boys. No worries.
My kids want to come into the studio.
Yeah, no worries. That's the beautiful thing about
Yeah.
a podcast, right?
Yeah.
It's the whole real thing.
Yeah,
Anyway,
but that's really cool. But also, yeah, of course, the FabFilter plugins. I still use the FabFilter plugins
Me
all
too.
the time. The FabFilter Pro Q3, the EQ from FabFilter, the new version, which I think is already a year old, maybe, has dynamic EQ functions, which means it's just boosting or cutting a frequency just when that frequency is peaking.
Yeah.
So you can take, for instance, a hi-hat down just when that hi-hat is there. And for the rest, it's going to be left alone and you don't hear what's going on there. And that's really brilliant. You can really do a lot of cool things. Wait a minute.
Yeah, sure.
Jongens, jullie moeten echt even weg. Weg. Ja, straks. Okay, I'm back. They want attention.
Yeah, it's kids, right?
Go to help them soon,
But that sounds great because it kind of works like a compressor in that case, as in it only starts
it is.
working when
Yeah.
it hits the threshold.
Yeah, that's why they call it a dynamic EQ. It is kind of like a multiband compressor, but in this case, a compressor, you have to control attack, release, things like that. But in this case, you just have to make it a dynamic EQ, and you don't have to think about timing like attack, release, whatever. You can set the threshold by hand, but you can also do it automatically. And it simply adds, boosts, or cuts that frequency just when that frequency is there. And it's really brilliant.
Yeah, that's really
So,
brilliant.
Yeah, in the beginning I was like, yeah, I'm not going to use that function when I was beta testing it, but in practice I'm using it multiple times a day because you have so much more control over just one frequency area. Because the thing is, with mastering, you're working on the stereo mix, and with the stereo mix you're always changing something else. For instance, if you want to take the hi-hat down because the hi-hat is too loud and you take down, let's say, 10 kilohertz, you're not just taking down the hi-hat, you're also taking down some things in the vocals, some things in the synthesizer, whatever is there. It's at the same frequency. But with a dynamic EQ, because it's just working on the loud sections, it's grabbing those peaks, you just take that down, and after that, it's going back to the same point
Leave the
again.
rest alone, yeah. Makes sense.
The rest is left alone, yeah. Sure, it's not always foolproof, because sometimes you just cannot boost or cut those things, but in practice, it really helps me a lot to use dynamic EQ nowadays. Yeah. And that's something which you cannot do with analog equipment.
Really? Because the metering?
Because that technique is simply pretty much impossible with analog technique. You can just do it with digital. So yeah, and that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it looks like I'm gonna leave you alone. I'm gonna leave you with your kids.
Yeah, they want attention.
Yeah, but we've been talking about an hour, so I can imagine why they want attention.
Studio, but it's the end of the day.
Exactly, no worries. So, thank you for your time, and thank you for all the explanation and all the tips and tricks.
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks again, and maybe we'll see you again this year or next year. We'll see.
Pretty sure. Yeah, hopefully.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Okay, man. See ya.
Bye.
Cheers.